This is Perspectives, a bi-weekly investment podcast brought to you by Escala Partners. In a world cluttered with information, Perspectives cuts through the noise to bring you insights and commentary on global financial markets, economics, and geopolitical news and events.
Welcome to Escala Partners Investment Perspectives. I'm Ed Brooke, and there's no shortage of topics to discuss today, but pivotal to everything at the moment, it seems, is the United States. And although we can review economic data and news updates, it's important to have boots on the ground to really assess the impact of US policy firsthand. And so, joining me today from New York is our CIO, Tracey McNaughton. Howdy, Tracey.
G'day, Ed.
Now, Tracey, let's start with some observations of what you've seen and heard on the ground. What stood out the most?
Well, the first observation I would make is the impact of government spending cuts, especially the DOGE-led ones at the airports. Hundreds of FAA staff have been let go. There's been a lot of talk about what happened at Newark Airport with the multiple radar outages. It's been all over the news here. Overworked traffic controllers are now taking stress leave, which no doubt will contribute to the issue. I mean, most foreigners would agree it's never seamless traveling through US airports. This has only made the situation worse. Checking through LA airport at border control, there were 80 booths for border control officers. Less than a fifth of those were occupied to channel 1,300 passengers through.
Wow. And how about the cities? You spent time in Chicago and New York, right?
That's right. Plenty of empty shops around where we were staying in downtown Chicago, we were right on Michigan Avenue. And even Michigan Avenue, there were a lot of empty shops. This seems to be a hangover from COVID. According to the data, about 1 in 3 shop fronts in the downtown area are vacant, in part due to the decline in office worker traffic. And we spoke to a lot of people and verified that. Very different in New York. It's still bustling with tourists everywhere. Interestingly, mostly European tourists. This may be due to the 10% rise in the euro against the dollar since the start of the year. Using the same logic, it's probably why I didn't hear or see too many Aussies about. But hotel occupancy across New York City is sitting at 85%. That's the highest in the country.
So what were people saying about China over there, Tracey?
Yeah, well, we had the opportunity to speak with quite a few advisors. And one advisor that I spoke to was very surprised to hear that BYD cars are outselling Tesla in Australia. She pointed out to me that there were no Chinese branded cars in the US. Chinese automakers like BYD, Geely and Chery and others do not have a direct presence in the US market, mainly due to high tariffs, regulatory barriers, and the lack of a dealer network. Obviously, the difference with Australia is that we no longer have a car-making industry to protect.
And how are the ports doing? I've been hearing some very concerning things there.
Yes, this was a lot in the news while we were in LA. The Port of Los Angeles, obviously, it's the major US entry point for cargo ships from China and Asia. And port traffic there is down 35% compared to this time last year. Vessel arrivals have fallen sharply. And on the news, there are conversations with workers that they aren't getting a full 40 hours of work per week, so they're concerned about layoffs. And then if you just add to that the other troubles for LA, the wildfire recovery costs, so the 18,000 homes lost in California due to those wildfires, and now rising construction material costs, especially lumber, which is 30% imported from Canada. So it's a real strain for the city right now.
Tracy, did you get any fresh data on trade?
Yes, we did while we were here. The April export data out of China, that was really telling. So strong growth in exports to Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Germany, Japan, and South Africa, but notably not the US, where exports were down sharply. China is pivoting, and fairly quickly, it seems, which reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody over lunch today, in fact. He said he's an American. and he supports what Trump is doing. He said China needs us more than we need them. And I'm not sure I agree with that. Of course, I didn't say this, but China can sell its goods into multiple destinations. And we see this in the trade data. We see it in Australia with the influx of BYD cars now. In contrast, the US cannot buy, at least at the price it's willing to pay, what it consumes from anyone. Now, it can manufacture some of those goods, but it can't manufacture everything. The unemployment rate is very low here at the moment, so they can't even just get the people to fill the manufacturing jobs. So in this regard, the US has the weaker hand.
Okay, Tracey, let's switch gears a bit. You mentioned some cultural shifts too.
Yes, Ed, 3 observations, I think, in this regard. The first one is the non-stop, almost, ads for the GLP-1 weight loss drug Wegovy. That was interesting. Also interesting were Trump administration ads offering undocumented immigrants $1,000 and a plane ticket to leave voluntarily. And the third observation was the car ads on TV. Nearly all of them are hammering the point that the vehicles are built in the USA. That's obviously a response to the recent 25% tariffs on imported cars.
And what about tech?
Well, cash is basically dead. Even street vendors use square readers. I entered the country, Ed, with $4 in my pocket, and I still have that $4. I didn't bring any cash in with me. In Whole Foods, which is a upmarket supermarket, if you like, that sells fresh food, you can now pay with your palm using Amazon One. So you place your palm over a reader and you can pay for your groceries that way. The tech shift is everywhere and it's frictionless. Having said that, plans to stop minting pennies has only just arrived. The Common Sense Act, that's sense as in CENTS, the Common Sense Act was introduced in the House last week, and that will demand all cash transactions be rounded up or down to the nearest 5 cents, eliminating the need for pennies. It was pointed out to me that Canada did this way back in 2012.
No doubt by a Canadian. Now let's pivot to markets. Tracey, you said it feels like a period of stasis. Can you unpack that?
Sure, Ed. You look at the real economy data and they suggest a relatively stable economy with strong jobs growth. And even when we look at the anecdotal evidence, things on the ground don't look too bad. People are still spending. I went to a Cubs game at Wrigley Stadium while I was in Chicago. And in the interest of research, Ed, I bought a beverage and paid $24 for it. Not only that, I had to queue for the privilege of paying that much.
And so what's the disconnect?
Well, Paul Donovan, the economist at UBS Wealth, presented at the CFA Conference, which we attended while we've been here. And he believes Trump's trade policy represents a structural break. The data, which are lagged, still reflects a world that, according to him, no longer exists. This is showing up in earnings reports with the sheer frequency of the word uncertainty. The longer the uncertainty plays out, the greater the impact on the real economy. And companies will delay plans to invest and hire, employment will fall, consumption will slow, and production will decline. And this scenario is yet to be priced in by the market. It's yet to really be seen. Investors, however, need to be paid to take on this uncertainty.
So let's talk specifically about earnings. What's the mood?
Well, a lot of companies are pulling guidance again, like they did during COVID. We're seeing this from Ford, Toyota, Kellogg, Mattel, Marriott, even British Airways have noted softer US demand, and Air Canada have flat out said it expects unstable travel demand. Consumer goods companies like Procter & Gamble, Nestle, and Unilever are mostly saying that tariffs mean prices for consumers will have to rise. So this is all the expectation. The problem is, outside of COVID, consumer confidence in the US hasn't been this low in 15 years. But unlike COVID, their wallet hasn't been fattened out by stimulus checks. So consumers may not be willing to bear the burden of higher prices again, as they did in 2022. And so that means companies will need to absorb in their margins or in their volume numbers these tariffs.
And what about currency?
Well, the big issue, especially when the US dollar is so volatile, is its impact on earnings. S&P 500 companies get about 40% of their revenue from abroad. So it does influence. For tech, it's higher, it's nearly 60%. So, between tariff risks and foreign currency swings, earnings visibility is very low.
Tracey, you mentioned the CFA conference that you went to in Chicago. What was the big takeaway there?
The first thing I would say is that around 2/3 of the conference was devoted to discussions around AI and private markets. So that tells you where the interest in the industry is. There was very little discussion on public listed equities. There might have been one session on emerging market equities, but that was about it.
So private equity is in vogue. Why is that?
Well, I took away from the conference that private equity is going to continue to grow, driven by two AI-related factors. The first one is the democratization of AI means new AI technology will come out of private startups who don't need big balance sheets. And the second is the adoption of AI amongst finance professionals and investors means the public equity market is likely to become even more efficient and so less attractive for investors seeking returns over and above what they could get from a passive strategy. An interesting statistic from the conference is that 80% of data is not found in spreadsheets. It's found in words. It's in the transcripts from earnings calls or from the pages of broker research. It's unstructured. Instead of showing you the documents, AI can synthesize what matters across any document. You don't need to spend hours reading it. So it's automating deep research. And so if anyone can now synthesize millions of data points and reports at speed, any remaining inefficiency that was left in public markets will be bid away.
That's huge. So what does this mean for junior analyst roles?
Well, this was a conversation that came up on the sidelines. AI won't replace them entirely, but it will speed up judgment development. The old apprenticeship model is vanishing. AI, I think, is to white-collar jobs what China was to blue-collared ones.
And Tracey, one of the issues we hear a lot about with private equity is the drop-off in public listings. Is this an issue for the asset class, do you think?
Well, there are lots of reasons why companies want to remain private. What we may start to see is transactions in the private market increasingly becoming more over the counter, if you like, in the same way as public credit previously traded over the counter. That is, deal by deal arranged directly between parties rather than through an exchange. And that is where the private equity market is trending, I think. We heard at a meeting in Chicago with a middle market private equity firm that a large Canadian pension plan needed liquidity and so easily arranged a private sale of a portion of their private equity holdings to another large pension plan. So public exits are not necessarily an issue for private equity.
Tracey, let's turn to geopolitics before we wrap. And the new UK-US trade deal got quite a bit of airtime in the press. What's your take?
It's marginal at best. The agreement is more political theatre than economic impact. I mean, less than 4% of US imports come from the UK, and under 10% of UK imports come from the US. The new framework lowers tariffs on British luxury cars into the US from 25% to 10%. That sounds great. I didn't see any British-made cars on the roads in my time here, and the data confirms this. Less than 1% of all new cars sold in the US were British-made. The big picture effect, Ed, I think is quite negligible. Most tariffs including on steel and aluminium, remain unchanged. The other point to make is that many details are still to be determined.
So this isn't going to fix the trade deficit.
Well, no, a prominent economist, Joseph Stiglitz, said the deal is not worth the paper it's written on. If the US administration wants to move the needle on trade deficits, then this deal doesn't get them there or anywhere close. I think what is more important are the trade deals that don't involve the US.
That's interesting. So do you think we'll see the US become more isolated?
I do. There's a kind of soft decoupling going on. Economic relationships are now being redefined, and while the US is focused inward on tariffs and industry policy, allies are hedging. They're building alternative trade routes. They're cooperating more with each other. That's not to say that the US is being abandoned, but it's no longer the sole center of gravity. The sessions on geopolitics at the CFA Conference made mention of this. Global systems are fracturing into regional and national interest zones. So I think what was more significant for the UK was the trade deal struck with India last week, between the UK and India. And unlike the hastily constructed and incomplete deal with the US, this deal comes after 3 years of negotiations. For India, it's about accessing the UK labour market. And for the UK, it's about India cutting tariffs on UK whiskey and cars. So both sides win.
What about Europe? We've heard a lot about the EU being slow to act in the past. Has that changed?
That's one of the most fascinating shifts happening right now. Europe's always had the ability, but not the willingness to change. They have deep pools of savings, they've got world-class innovation, and they've got ample fiscal space. But for years, they underutilized it. I think the kinds of decisions coming out of Washington are serving as a bit of a wake-up call for Europe. It's pushed Europe out of its inertia.
So you're saying US protectionism is acting like a catalyst to make Europe great again?
Mega, yes, possibly. Europe is realizing it can't rely on the transatlantic relationship in the way that it used to. We're seeing much more assertive language from Brussels about industrial strategy, capital markets union, and technology independence. And we've seen the rapid response, of course, too, in defense spending.
Yes, Tracey, that's a big pivot. So we've got the US leaning inward, Europe waking up, and global supply chains continuing to fracture. Sounds like geopolitics is back in the driver's seat.
Well, it absolutely is, Ed. Markets can't ignore it anymore. It used to be on the back burner, but now it's front and center. The old assumptions about free trade, open capital flows, and synchronized growth are all being challenged. We're in a new phase where politics isn't just background noise.
Tracey, this has been a brilliant overview. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and findings on the ground in the US.
Pleasure, Ed.
We hope everyone enjoyed the special podcast, Dispatches from the US, and we hope you can join us next time as we continue decoding the trends shaping markets, economies, and policy. Until then, please stay safe and safe travels home, Tracey.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you for listening to Escala Partners Perspectives podcast. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. You can connect with Tracey by visiting escalapartners.com.au. Escala Partners is a corporate authorized representative of Escala Wealth Management, which holds its own AFSL. This podcast has been prepared without consideration of specific client investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is for general information purposes only. Please don't rely on it for the purpose of making an investment decision. You should seek independent financial and taxation advice prior to making any investment decisions in relation to any of the content considered in the podcast, and consider any relevant disclosure documents. If you require any further information regarding the matters discussed on the podcast, please contact Escala Partners.